one less abomination in the world.
A few days ago, the first closed beta for Warhammer The End Times Vermintide 2 took place, allowing heroes worldwide the chance to try their hands at the rat-slaying sequel, and once again opening up the debate in our comments section as to whether I should be saying beta or beta. I say beta because I'm British, and yes, this is a hill I'm willing to die on. Anyway, I put a fair few hours into Vermintide 2, finding some things absolutely delightful, and a couple of things fairly worrying. Here's a quick rundown of both. We'll start with the good before we start questioning any design choices because, well, I'm not a complete monster. So first up, Vermintide 2 is very, very familiar, which is a comfort to be honest. While the community still has some gripes about bugs and optimization, there's very little about the way Vermintide handles that requires changing. Hitting a clan rat with a melee weapon is satisfyingly meaty, and there's a good sense of feedback from the thwack of an arrow that's ordinarily not very easy to capture. It's a really solid cooperative survival game, in other words, so it's good to know the basic structure has been retained for the sequel, including the player's love of rapidly squatting when waiting for things to happen. That's not to say it's exactly the same, mind you, there are some significant revisions that really impact how each hero handles. These are largely down to the careers, which I'll talk about separately in a bit, but the real headline change is that each character now has two abilities, one active and one passive. Passive abilities can include things like dropping small amounts of ammo for others whenever a special enemy gets killed, and one of Carillion's is that she slowly regenerates health, which is an absolute game changer. These active abilities, however, recharge, kind of like ultimates in games like Overwatch. Again, these abilities vary from hero to hero and from career to career, but they're generally abilities you're meant to pop at just the right moment, i.e. when things are getting a bit hairy to dig you out of trouble. Bardin can throw down a smoke bomb that hides him away, for example, allowing him to disengage from the enemy, and Carillion can fire out a volley of true flight arrows, useful for thinning out a big pack of enemies. Others, on the other hand, buff anyone in the nearby vicinity, like Saltspire, who can boost the critical chance of others around him for a few seconds, or Kruber, who can give nearby allies a chunk of temporary health to help keep them upright during a difficult fight. There's a tricky balance to be struck with these abilities, but from what I experienced, I think they're pitched at about the right level. They're not so powerful as to render an encounter completely harmless, but they recharge at a pace that lets you use each ability a good few times during each mission without constantly spamming them out. They're a nice addition, in other words, meaning you feel more like you're playing a particular character build. As I mentioned briefly, these talents form the backbone of the new careers system, an approach to the characters designed to promote a sense you're aiming for a particular playstyle. Bardin the Dwarf, for example, can be played as a ranger, keeping him from getting into the fray too often as he uses his crossbow to great effect, and crucially, keeps others firing, by way of giving them ammo. In stark contrast, however, you can play him as an Ironbreaker, drawing aggro from the enemies around him with his special ability, and soaking up plenty of damage as his foes crash against that famous one-man shield wall he keeps banging on about. Finally, you can play him as a Slayer, a career that, as you might have guessed, is all about getting stuck in and collecting heads, rather than pure tanking. Likely you'll know how you personally like to play already, but with each career unlocking at a certain level for each character, and each character levelling up separately, you'll have plenty of time to experiment, and maybe gain a new appreciation for an approach to combat you didn't try before. I'll admit when Vermintide 2 was initially announced, I was kind of hoping for some new heroes, but on balance, I'm actually kind of glad the sequel revisits the original cast in order to bring a bit more depth to each, rather than drumming up entirely new classes. Now, doubtless you will have noticed in the gameplay you've seen so far that A, I am not very good at using the spear, and B, that I've been killing enemies that most certainly are not rats. The Warriors of Chaos have joined the party for Vermintide 2, bringing with them plenty of axes, some pointy helmets, and a really bad attitude. To be more precise, in fact, the Northmen on offer in Vermintide 2 are the Rotbloods, an especially grim clan devoted to Nurgle, also known as the god of pestilence. Because if you're going to introduce new enemies, why not make them disgusting? While it's still a bit weird to see human enemies allying with Skaven on screen, I think the Rotbloods are actually a pretty good inclusion. They're fairly tough customers, but they're also chatty in a menacing way that the average Skaven can't really match. Fond as I am of the Servants of the Horned Rat, there's no denying that the Skaven mode of Speak is a little, well, cute cute. Even when they're coming to tear you to pieces, the dialogue coming out of the rat men, well, it just seems a bit ridiculous. The Northmen, on the other hand, definitely do not suffer from the same problem, shouting as they do about how they're going to horribly murder you, praising the forces of pestilence and decay as they do so, sometimes in rhyming verse. Now, while we're talking about menacing new enemies, hopefully you'll recall I talked about the average Skaven while saying how I didn't find their rat speech scary. It's important to make that distinction in Vermintide 2 because plague monks are a thing now, they definitely do scare me, and they sound like this. Plague monks may not look that different to your average clan rat, but trust me, they are definitely strong enough to make you sit up and pay attention. Shrieking as they come, clad in sickly green robes, the plague monks are capable of dishing out a flurry of attacks with their fetid blades that can do you some serious damage. This is pleasingly similar to how they behave in the tabletop game, if you were wondering, as charging the enemy in Age of Sigmar increases the number of attacks they get to do. In stark contrast to the tabletop game, however, they can absorb loads of damage, making them one of the trickiest enemies to deal with in the course of a mission. Until you get to the new special enemies, that is. Storm Fiends, Warpfire Throwers, Bile Trolls and Chaos Spawn are just a few of the new specials, each with their own attacks and strategies. And most of them are horrible. No, scratch that. All of them are horrible. The variety is really lovely, although, and this might just be me, it does make the appearance of a special from the first game, a Gutter Runner for example, feel a bit like a cameo rather than a real threat. Weird, I know, but it was oddly distracting. While we're on the special enemies, actually now is probably a good time to slide into the things I wasn't so wild on during my time with Vermintide 2. First, this is a very minor thing, but the biggest of special enemies, a Rat Ogre or Chaos Spawn for example, now come complete with a health bar, which is something I'm really not very keen on, to be perfectly honest. There's something about lugging away at a Rat Ogre in Vermintide, not knowing whether it can only sustain one more hit or 100, that's really exciting. That unknown element and those moments of thinking, oh my god, why won't this thing die, have been stripped out, and that's kind of sad. It reminds you how much of a numbers game is going on behind the scenes, and more than that, I think it motivates that part of players that compels them to get the last hit in, making them rush in and put themselves at risk when otherwise they wouldn't. And I say that as an elf main. The rest of the game's presentation also has me feeling a little bit ambivalent. The UI is, well, it's interesting. Really, I'm not entirely sure how to feel about it. On one hand, I like the bar at the bottom, showing how close you are to having your ability charged up, but the rest has me sitting firmly on the fence. I quite like the look of the character health bars on the left-hand side, but I was quite happy with them down the bottom, as in the first game. The special enemy kill feed, meanwhile, is now in the top right-hand corner, reminiscent of a bunch of games, most notably shooters like Overwatch. To be honest though, sticking the kill feed in the corner has meant I treat it much like the one in Overwatch, which is to say, I forget it's there entirely. Having special enemy kill notifications pop up in the chat window in Vermintide may not be elegant, but it's a damn good way to make sure that information is seen. The UI in Vermintide 2 isn't awful by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel like it's attempting to fix a number of things that weren't broken in the first place. The way information is presented is also a bit of a muddle, at least in my opinion, when you're between missions as well. In particular, I know I can craft in Vermintide 2, but at no point during the beta did I really have much of a sense of how much material I had to do any crafting. There's an element of functional simplicity that's been lost between the first and the second game, and certainly at first, it's all a bit confusing. The loot system has also been revamped. Leveling up or completing a mission now gives you, well, it's a loot box. I'll say up front, I actually quite like this system. You get a basic chest when you complete a mission, and then there are certain bonuses, like being in quick play mode or picking up tomes along the way, that increase the quality of that chest and the items inside it. On opening the chest, those items will be specifically for the class you have equipped, so even if you've been playing with lots of different characters, you can still focus entirely on just one in order to get better gear. It's clearly better targeted, and that's a good thing, but I just can't help but feel Fat Shark is playing with fire by scooping up all that gear and sticking it in boxes of different quality tiers. It's actually already been confirmed that there are no paid loot boxes in Vermintide 2, all loot comes from gameplay, but there's just something about seeing those little oblongs shining away in-game that feels a bit jarring. While it is great there are no microtransactions, however, perception is always an important thing to consider. So that's what I think of Vermintide 2 anyway. One or two minor gripes, but on the whole I think it's looking pretty positive. Especially with some gorgeous new environments to look at. I mean, cutting down Northmen in golden fields of grain. What more could you ask for? I'd genuinely like to know, actually, so feel free to share your thoughts on Vermintide 2 in the comments below. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, there are loads more from Eurogamer for you to watch, so feel free to give one of them a click and we can do this whole thing all over again. Do like and subscribe because it does really help us out. Thank you very much for watching, and have a lovely day.